Welcome to SCRS Talks provided by the Society for Clinical Research Sites. Thank you for joining us as we explore the latest trends, insights, and innovations shaping clinical research today. I'm Jimmy Bechtel, the Chief Site Success Officer with SCRS, and I'm joined today by KimberLee Heidmann, the Executive Vice President, Quality and Regulatory, and the Data Protection Officer at Scout. KimberLee, really excited to have you today and to talk a little bit about payment burden that sites and patients face and some of the cool things that we are seeing being done in the industry to solve some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jimmy. I'm always excited to talk to our partners at SCRS, so thanks for allowing this. Yes, I am currently serving as the head of quality and regulatory affairs at Scout. I also serve as our data protection officer. I've been with the organization for 25 years. And so I've had the opportunity to hold several different positions at the organization and learn a lot about research. Before I was at the company, I worked for a subsidiary of the World Health Organization, and so have been in the research space since the late 90s. It's a joy to be able to work on more of the patient-facing side now here at Scout. What we do in our clinical division is that we provide support to research sites and participants of clinical research by providing logistics services and payment services to the participants to offset any financial burden and also logistical burden. That's the goal and the desire of Scout, to really enhance the health of people by supporting research around the world. We are a global company, and so we have the opportunity to work with sites and participants all over the world. And we are contracted by the sponsors and the CROs to provide that service. In our meetings division, we provide training and trial collaboration with the research sites, bringing them to all different types of meetings, including investigators meetings, advisory board meetings, et cetera. So really offering the full scope of our services starts with education and training and collaboration and goes all the way to trial participation and retention. So that's what we do and why it's very important to us that we partner with SCRS.
Excellent. Thanks, KimberLee. Thanks for expanding on that. And we value partnership, and partnership is exactly one of the ways in which we go about solving some of these challenges and learn together around payment burden that the sites and the patients face. And sites often pay, as we know, some of those stipends and other costs up front before the sponsor payments arrive. So they're footing the bill, if you will, or fulfilling their needed obligation to the patients who are participating in these clinical trials. So how does that cash flow gap impact site operations and sustainability? I'm really interested to hear your perspective on this, being with your background as well as, being at the service provider perspective.
Yeah, so we have done quite a bit of research, and we have a site engagement team that does a lot of work directly with the sites talking about these various types of issues. Specifically, the cash flow question has come up quite often, and also in some of the work we've done with SCRS, doing surveys of the sites. One of the things that we learned is that the approach to cash flow does vary, and you understand that, how sites manage their overhead and their cash flow and how they pay out their invoices and request invoices. It does vary across those small independent sites to larger site organizations. But one thing is always true. The outlay of cash for participant stipends or real-time logistics management, those things hit the site's daily operating expenses. So they're often not remunerated quickly. The sponsors and the sites are doing the best they can. CROs are doing the best they can to make sure that site payments and the offset of those expenses is done quickly. However, there are timeframes involved, and there's just the nature of the business and moving those invoices and payments back and forth. So the gaps in that timing creates a tension in the site cash flow, and that impacts the other site expenditures. All these sites know if you're waiting for that payment for the outlay of cash that you've done for logistics and stipends, which is real hard dollars, then that could impact other expenditures at the site, like staffing, which without staffing and without paid staff, you can't keep the trial running. So over time, these gaps tend to snowball and make that tension greater. You also have to consider high volume trials When sites are putting out funds for stipends or reimbursements, or they're actually putting the time and effort into organizing the real-time logistics, high volume trials accelerate that problem. So what we see is really that sites and sponsors can work together on this problem by, first of all, eliminating the unnecessary expenditure. So the first step that we would recommend is, well, just don't put that on the sites to actually have to make those payments or provide that logistics support in real time. And then also there are obviously the other offsets that can be done, which would be, monthly payment models or advanced payment models to sites. But if the sites don't have to worry about this and they actually don't have to take that money out of their reserves, then the impact is mitigated completely.
A lot of great points there, KimberLee. I really appreciate the perspective around, I guess, the solution around, let's not even put it into the realm of worry at the site level. Let's remove that as something that they have to worry about. There's a lot of different ways we can do that. You mentioned some of them, right? Paying on time, paying monthly, and prepaying for those things and making sure that the sites have those funds, because you're 100% correct in that we see so many sites that live, quote unquote, right, paycheck to paycheck with their clinical trial reimbursements and expenditures. So when we have to take from Peter to give to Paul, as it were, it's challenging for the sites to understand and prioritize how that's going to happen, especially in tighter times.
Yeah.
So we're also seeing, KimberLee, sites add overhead fees to these contracts to cover some of these administrative burdens of managing some of the patient services themselves. So what's driving this trend, and what does it say about the current ecosystem when sites are having to go about doing things this way?
Well, I think it's, we've built on this topic and what we've already discussed. Payments to clinical trial participants and the cost of logistics support, that's real dollars. It's real dollars and time. Many of these sites may not have the staff to allocate specifically to this activity or the additional time for administrative activities. So payment reconciliations, certain things that are involved in tax reporting if you're providing stipends. So it's very hard because you don't know what these costs are going to be. It's very hard for sites to project the cost and the impact at the beginning of budget negotiation. So for example, if a site has been involved with certain studies where they've provided these services in the past and they've had to outlay these funds in the past, they may have that anecdotal experience, but they may not have the bandwidth or the internal systems to actually track that so that they can quantify it when they're projecting their budgets. Some sites talk about needing to incorporate the overhead fees to protect themselves, right? If I'm going to incur higher costs, and sometimes costs for stipends or logistics can go up year over year, and especially with higher volume studies, it's hard for them to project. So they really need to be clear and they need to be proactive when they're looking at those overhead fees and when they're looking at those expenses. And, what it says about the current system, in my opinion, as a provider in the space, is that there really is an undeniable benefit to sites to pivot away from what they may have always done, which is doing this themselves, taking on the administrative and financial activities of organizing and coordinating and paying for logistics and stipends and reimbursements. They may have always done that before, but really there's no question that there's a benefit to taking advantage of the shift we're seeing with sponsors where they're using third-party providers like Scout to remove that burden. It's really becoming an undeniable fact, although early in our days when I would sit down with sites and leaders in the industry, they would often say, well, there is this thought from sites that companies like Scout and Scout in particular might be taking away some opportunity for a site to have additional fees or services that they're providing and take advantage of those fees. The reality is it's more of a burden on the site to provide the services and have the internal systems and administrative activities than it's worth. So I think that's what it says about the current system. We want the clinical trial sites to be able to put their resources, their finances, and their time into what they're experts at, which is conducting the trials. And along with the sponsors that contract Scout, we see the value as the experts at what we do and letting us do what we do really well. And that's making this process a whole lot easier and removing that burden from the sites.
I couldn't agree more, KimberLee. We talk about this concept now with the implementation of AI on the clinical trials. This is a really great example of a way that we can remove the quote unquote administrative burden, all these extra ancillary tasks away from the site where they might not be proficient in it or experts in it or efficient in it, like a service provider might, but also be able to have the ability to dedicate their time to more value add activities and drive additional trial revenue, see and treat patients. The most important thing, like you said and stated so eloquently, they're here really to do. So moving, when we see these additional things being tacked on or added into our overhead fees, it's a sign of the times or a sign that something isn't right. Because anytime we're having to add something to overhead beyond your standard inflationary costs for things that are probably unavoidable, we do start to see some problems that arise from that.
Mm-hmm.
Patients sometimes face unexpected medication costs related to trial participation. We know this isn't uncommon. It remains an issue within the industry. And sites really are on the end trying to troubleshoot these issues. Where are these costs coming from? Why are they happening? So where should the responsibility for some of that lie? And how can service providers like Scout really help with managing that additional, what one could argue, related administrative cost?
Yeah, I have been very fortunate that in a lot of the trials that we've supported of late with the sponsors that we're working with, they have anticipated, because we've seen this. I think, Jimmy, this is important to note that this is not a new thing that we're seeing, right? Unexpected medication costs. You've also got the cost of unexpected imaging or tests, labs, other health-related expenses that sometimes occur. And there's been conversations in the industry about how do we work with insurance? How do we work with patients that don't have that? How do we cover these costs? How do we anticipate them? And one of the things that I've noticed, because Scout often has the opportunity to talk with clients about when they're looking at populations or looking at more complex studies, and they're asking us, what do we see? We're saying, well, there's a way to provide for this. There's a way to provision this so that the sites are not scrambling and the patients are not burdened. The way to do it is talk about it in advance. When you're looking at the protocol design, the study design, and you're thinking about your population, you're thinking about your location, these potential unexpected costs or things that arise are something that can be considered, just like I would say the unanticipated barriers to logistical participation can be anticipated, right? We just have to have those conversations and say, what are the chances that this could happen? Now, we can't anticipate everything, but what we can say is our previous historic experience tells us that this is a possibility. And what are solutions that we can put into place at the very outset that don't really cost us anything unless we get to that bridge? If we get to that bridge and we have to cross it, there's probably going to be some expenses, but let's put the regulatory in place. Let's put the right providers in place so that if we get there, the sites aren't scrambling. So if there are potential expenses that patients may have incurred during this study that we're not sure about, these could be labs, very specific dietary regimens or over-the-counter products, things like that might create an additional burden. And when the patient says, I can't do this, how am I going to pay for it? That study coordinator is thinking, we got to do this to stay adherent to the study processes. So now I got to scramble to support this patient. So rather than doing that, let's put the regulatory in place. Let's have the conversation in advance and put the tools together in the toolbox to solve that problem if we get there. And that's something that Scout has a lot of experience with and we've done. So I always say, just let me engage in the conversation with the project teams or with those folks at the sponsor or the CRO that are discussing this so we can put together some solution.
That's really excellent, KimberLee. Exciting to hear that there's a path forward for that. I know we'll get into that in just a moment as we begin to wrap our conversation up, right? We've been talking a lot about the challenges and setting the stage for what the industry is seeing, what the trends are. And you bring some great points up around this theme of, let's do the work to identify what some of those administrative burdens are and understand how they affect the site and then build solutions around those. How does Scout help alleviate the financial and administrative burdens that sites face when they're managing this concept and this task really around patient payments and reimbursements?
So I think the first thing, just to remind our audience, is that Scout services are generally provided via our contract with the sponsor or the CRO for a trial. What we've seen in the industry is a greater level of adoption by sponsors and CROs to utilize and partner with, to collaborate with companies like Scout, and I would say Scout is leading in this, is to pivot away from the way that things were done previously and think in a fresh new way about incorporating Scout into their ecosystem. And so even in countries and cultures where we see a slower uptake on sites pivoting away from doing it how they always have, the first thing is for sites to understand that this is something that Scout does under contract with the sponsor and the CRO, and then we can provide those services to the sites in a much simpler way for them. And it's really important for the sites to know that this is just adoption on their part, right? We do everything we can to reduce their having to sign on to additional tools. In fact, several of our large sponsors, we have SSO integrations. We try to make it as simple as possible for them to access our systems. We really just want to promote that adoption and make it simple. If they can see that and understand that foundationally, then they understand that the impact of using a company like Scout starts from the outset, because you don't have to worry about how you're going to address stipends, payments, retention for, based on overcoming burdens for logistics. You don't have to think about that when you're doing your budget projections and your CTA negotiation. You know that process is going to be turned in terms of utilizing Scout. So I think that's the first way that it starts at the outset: budget projection, CTA negotiation, and then it translates into the day-to-day, the resourcing at sites, staffing burdens. Sites can begin to think differently about how they staff and where they put their talent if they know they don't have to put their talent into these administrative activities around these patient services. And that goes all the way down through. We have sites that are asking questions and are concerned about tax reporting, acting as a payor. How do I do this? Well, you don't have to put the time and energy into thinking about that or staffing it or thinking about the internal systems to track and measure it if you can adopt the services that we're that we're providing via the sponsor. So this lets the sites really put the emphasis on conducting the trial, like we said earlier, and meeting the timelines. And at the most important level, on patient care, right? Spending more time at the visit with the patient rather than saying, okay, let's spend 15, 20 minutes going over your receipts. We don't have to do that. They can take the time with their patients, and it maximizes efficiency for the sites. And to be quite frank, for those who are managing the sites or own the sites, it impacts their bottom line. So I would say that a well-structured strategy for logistics and payments to the participants really is fundamental to the efficiency of trials, also fundamentally to participant-centered research. As you know, we've talked with SCRS quite a lot about this. And we believe that utilizing Scout as the premier partner helps the entire trial ecosystem. You streamline the logistics, the payment mechanisms, you reduce recruitment and participation barriers to reach more diverse populations and improve trial outcomes. At the end of the day, the positive impact on trial sites who use Scout is very fundamental. Reduce the time and money you're spending on budget negotiations and overhead. Free up your cash flow for what's necessary for your business to succeed, and focus on patient care. Meet the study timelines. These are the best outcomes for every stakeholder in our industry.
Thanks, KimberLee. I think it's a really strong case for going down these kinds of paths and enabling these kinds of augmentative services onto clinical trials. Some of what you've heard from the sites, and kind of dig into where things are at, but we're out of time for today. So maybe a conversation for another time, but really thank you and thank Scout for the time today and for building solutions with the sites and the patients in mind. Again, excited to continue to bolster the partnership that I know we continue to establish. Again, sites. Thank you.
Thanks, Jimmy. It's been wonderful talking with you as always.
I couldn't agree more. And for everyone listening, I hope that you make sure to check out other great site-focused resources made available to our entire community on our website, myscrs.org, including other podcasts and webcasts like this one, and opportunities to become involved with partners like Scout. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time.